You feel the last dry flakes of winter skin rub off your fingertips as you tap your screen. A scar on your knuckle from a door that stuck in the cold last January tightens faintly in the conditioned air. You sit in a room held at a steady 21 degrees Celsius, a bubble of perpetual spring, and you just scrolled past a forecast for snow. But that tightness in your knuckle is an echo. That dry skin is a ghost. Your body still carries the memory of a different world, one where the cold was not a forecast, but a predator, one where winter was not a season to dress for. It was a force that winnowed the human species down to its absolute toughest survivors, and every single one of them was your ancestor. You are here because they won. A war fought not with spears, but with shivering. A war fought in the dark, on empty stomachs, against a cold so deep it could stop a heart between one breath and the next. For 99.9% of human history, winter was not picturesque. It was a bottleneck, a population crash waiting to happen, a test most of our relatives failed. Picture a band of 30 people, your ancestors, in a valley in Ice Age Europe 30,000 years ago. The last berries were eaten weeks ago. The migrating herds have vanished over the southern hills. The migrating herds have vanished over the southern hills. The first snows are not soft and silent. They are a wet, heavy blanket that soaks the hides of their shelters and collapses the fragile structure of their world. The cold doesn't just make them uncomfortable. It begins a silent, physiological siege. First, it attacks their hands. Fingers go numb, clumsy. The fine motor control needed to repair a snare, to nap a new spear point. 2. Kindle a fire from the last precious embers. It fades. A simple task becomes life or death fumbling. Then the cold moves inward. To stay alive, their bodies burn fuel at a terrifying rate. They need calories not just to move, but simply to maintain the furnace of their own core temperature. An adult, sitting still in the cold, can burn twice the calories they would in comfort. And there is no food. So the body starts to consume itself. It raids its own fat stores. Then it begins to break down muscle. Weakness sets in, a deep lethargy. The mind, starved of energy, slows. Decisions become foggy. The will to venture out into the blinding white, to maybe, possibly find a frozen carcass under the snow, it dims. It's safer to stay near the fading fire, to huddle, to sleep. And sleep, in deep cold, is a trap. The shivering that keeps you awake is actually your last defense. It's your muscles burning precious energy to generate heat. To stop shivering, to slip into that peaceful, warm-feeling sleep, is to slide into hypothermia and never wake up. This was the baseline reality. Winter was a culling. It killed the very young and the very old first. It killed the injured, the sick, the unlucky. If even one of your direct ancestors, in any of these bands across hundreds of thousands of years, had failed this test, you would not be reading this. Your lineage would have ended in a snowdrift. So how did they not just endure, but prevail? How did they turn winter from an existential threat into a season they could not only survive, but sometimes even thrive within? The obvious answers are there: fire, shelter, for clothing. But those are just the tools. The real secret is what they built with those tools. A biological and social fortress so ingenious, it's still woven into your instincts today. Archaeologists once viewed these ancient winters as a time of scarcity and desperate hibernation, a season of loss to be grimly endured until spring. But then they began to look closer at the trash heaps, at the bones left behind from meals eaten in the deepest dark of the year, and they found something that didn't fit the story of mere survival. They found evidence of feasting in a cave in what is now southern England. From a layer dated to a brutal glacial winter 15,000 years ago, researchers found the bones of a single red deer. But these weren't the scattered fragments of a scavenged kill. The bones were piled together, many of them cracked open for their marrow, the richest, most calorie-dense part. The pattern showed this wasn't a family gnawing on scraps. This was a deliberate, communal consumption of a large, nutritious animal in the dead of winter. Where did it come from? How did they hunt it? And why use such a precious resource all at once, instead of rationing it stingily over weeks? The answer lies not in the bone, but in the invisible structure around it. That deer was not just calories. It was a social event, a reason to gather, to share warmth, to tell stories in the flickering light, to strengthen the bonds that were literally keeping everyone alive. Winter was when the group mattered most. Isolation was death. But this feasting implies something even more profound. They weren't just reacting to winter. They were planning for it. They were storing more than food. They were storing cohesion. And that reveals the first pillar of the ancient winter survival strategy. One so subtle we've almost forgotten it's a skill. It wasn't about fighting the cold head-on. It was about a radical, deliberate slowing down. Your body still knows how to do this. When you lounge on a sofa under a blanket on a Sunday, feeling that contented inertia, you are touching the edge of a deep ancestral wisdom. In the freezing months, every movement had a cost. A hunt that failed meant not only no food, but hundreds of calories burned in the chase. A net loss that could tip the scales toward starvation. So they learned to move with an exquisite economy, to sit for hours by a water hole, almost perfectly still, waiting for a chance, to mend clothing with slow, deliberate stitches by the faint light of a seal oil lamp, to tell long, intricate stories that transported the group without anyone having to burn energy to go anywhere. This was a culture of conservation, where patience was not a virtue, but a physiological necessity. And at the center of it all was the fire, not just as a source of heat, but as a biological catalyst. New research into the smoke from burning specific woods and resins suggests its role was far more sophisticated than we imagined. The smoke was a shield, a medicine, a seasonal supplement, which leads to the open loop, the mystery in the ashes. In site after site, from the steppes of Siberia to the forests of North America, archaeologists find hearths from winter campsites with peculiar, thick layers of ash, containing the remains of certain trees, pine, juniper, cedar. Not just the charcoal from cooking. This is a residue of smoke deliberately produced, and, the evidence suggests, sat in. For hours, the people weren't just warming their skin by the flames. They were immersing their entire respiratory system in a haze of medicinal smoke. They were, in essence, fumigating themselves. But why? What did they understand about that smoke that we, in our sterile, conditioned air, have completely forgotten? The answer is hidden in your own immune system, and in a desperate bargain our ancestors made with the very season that tried to kill them. The scent of a pine tree, for you, is a candle, a cleaner, a nostalgic hint of the holidays. But breathe it in deeply. That sharp, clean bite at the back of your throat. That is the ghost of the shield. Inside that smoke are compounds called phytoncides. They are the tree's own immune system, volatile chemicals released to ward off fungi, bacteria, and insects. When your ancestors breathed air thick with the smoke of burning pine or juniper, they were not just tolerating the haze. They were bathing their lungs in a low-dose, constant mist of natural antimicrobials. Winter was a time of incredible vulnerability. People were packed into tight, sealed shelters for months. Ventilation meant heat loss, so the air grew stagnant. If a respiratory pathogen got inside, a cough, a fever, it could race through the entire group and doom them all. They had no antibiotics, no decongestants. Their one defense was prevention, and they found it in the fire. The smoke was a purifier. It dried the damp air that molds love. It suppressed the microbes that thrive in close quarters. Think of a woman in that Siberian winter camp 20,000 years ago, carefully placing another bundle of green juniper branches onto the coals. She isn't just feeding the flame for warmth. She is watching the thick, fragrant smoke billow up and fill the enclosed space, seeing it settle on the sleeping hides, on the people breathing deeply in their sleep. She is, in that moment, the tribe's pharmacist. She is administering a seasonal vaccine. This was the bargain. They traded the certainty of some lung irritation from the smoke for the overwhelming threat of a deadly winter plague. Their bodies adapted to it. Some research suggests that long-term, low-level exposure to certain wood smokes can actually strengthen mucosal immune defenses in the respiratory tract. It's a hardening, a conditioning. Your ancestors' lungs learned to work within that smoky haze, and in doing so, became more resilient to what it was keeping at bay. But the smoke was only part of the fortress. The real architectural marvel was the social structure itself, the one the winter feast was designed to reinforce. Winter dissolved the concept of the individual. You were not one person trying to stay warm. You were a node in a living circuit of heat exchange. Picture the sleeping arrangements in that same Ice Age shelter. They didn't sleep alone. They slept in a tight, nested puzzle of bodies. The smallest children were tucked into the center, against the warmest adult torsos. The elderly, who might struggle to generate their own heat, were placed in the middle ring. The healthy adults, the strongest furnaces, slept on the outer edges, taking the brunt of the cold that seeped through the hides. They rotated these positions through the night, so no one person bore the chill for too long. They shared body heat as deliberately as they shared meat. This created a thermal bubble. A single person, sleeping alone in the cold, might burn 40% more calories just to stay warm through the night. A group of 5, sleeping huddled, could cut that metabolic cost in half for every single person. Those saved calories were the difference between starvation and sustenance. That extra energy was redirected to a mother producing milk, to a child's growing brain, to the immune system fighting off a minor infection. The group became a single organism. And this is where the mind had to evolve. The constant, grinding stress of winter, the hunger, the confinement, the fear, could easily fracture a group. Resentment over food sharing, irritation from constant closeness, the despair that comes with endless gray skies. A fractured group was a dead group, so they developed winter psychology. They turned the prison into a ceremony. The long, dark hours became the canvas for culture. This is when the most elaborate stories were told, when genealogies were recited, when the myths of how the world began were passed down. The flickering firelight wasn't just for heat. It was the first cinema, casting shadows that became spirits and beasts on the cave wall. The repetitive, meticulous work of tool-making and hide-sewing became a meditation. The rhythmic scraping of a flint flake, the pulling of a sinew thread, these were sounds of safety, of continuity. They were auditory proof that life was still being maintained, stitch by stitch, moment by moment. And this psychology is etched into you. That craving for hygge, for coziness, for soft lighting and warm drinks and close friends on a cold night. That isn't a modern invention. It's a deep, biological memory of the survival strategy that worked. That feeling of contentment you get when you are safe, fed, and warm among people you trust. That is the emotional signature of a successful winter strategy 50,000 years running. Your brain rewards you for recreating the exact conditions that kept your ancestors alive. But here is the twist, the moment that changes everything. All of this, the smoke, the huddling, the storytelling, was about building a fortress and waiting out the siege. And for a long time, scientists believed that was the whole story. Humans endured winter. They gritted their teeth and survived it. Then, they looked at the teeth. Not human teeth. Animal teeth. Specifically, the teeth of the animals our ancestors ate in the depths of winter. By analyzing microscopic wear patterns on reindeer and horse teeth found in winter occupation sites, researchers could tell not just what they ate, but when. And the patterns revealed something astonishing. These animals weren't eating the dry, dead grass from under the snow. The wear patterns showed they were eating something gritty, something that suggested they were digging through ice or gravelly soil to get at it. They were eating winter greenery, lichen, mosses, tough, cold-weather plants. And if the reindeer were finding it, then the humans hunting them knew exactly where to look. This wasn't about stumbling upon a starving, weakened animal. This was about understanding the winter ecosystem, with a precision that turned the season from a barren wasteland into a structured, knowable pantry. The deepest evidence of this, however, comes from a place that seems utterly silent, the ocean. On coastlines from Norway to British Columbia to the tip of South America, archaeologists find massive, ancient shell middens, piles of clam, mussel, and oyster shells that are thousands of years old. For decades, they were seen as signs of easy summer foraging. But then scientists started using a technique called seasonal cementum analysis on the shells themselves. Like tree rings, shells grow in microscopic layers that change with the seasons. You can literally see the winter growth line when they analyzed shells. From deep inside these middens, from layers associated with winter tools and hearths, they found the truth. A huge number of these shellfish were harvested in the dead of winter, not as a last resort, but as a planned, reliable resource. While the land seemed locked in ice, the intertidal zone, kept from freezing by the salt water, offered a cold, abundant, and predictable harvest. It required incredible knowledge of tides, of moon cycles, of which rocky crevices would be most productive, and it required going out into the freezing wind and water to get it. This changes the entire narrative. They weren't just hunkering down. They were operating. They had a winter calendar, a winter economy. They knew that the deepest cold of February was also the time when certain mussels were at their plumpest, their most caloric. They were not passive victims of the season. They were its active managers, which leads to the final, most intimate piece of evidence. It's not found in a shell or a bone. It's found in the human body itself, in a quiet mutation that swept through northern populations. Most adults, everywhere in the world, gradually lose the ability to digest lactose, the sugar in milk. After childhood, It's the default state for our species. But in populations whose ancestors relied heavily on herding animals in places like Scandinavia and the Asian steppes, something different happened. The ability to digest lactose persisted into adulthood. This trait, called lactase persistence, is one of the clearest and strongest examples of natural selection in recent human history. And the selection pressure wasn't the lush spring meadows. It was winter. Imagine a herding community on the frozen steppe 6,000 years ago. The grasses are buried. The game is scarce. But the livestock, goats, sheep, later cattle, are still alive. They are living stores of calories. In the summer and fall, you might eat their meat. But in winter, killing your breeding stock is a death sentence for next year. So you take their milk instead. You ferment it into yogurts and cheeses that can last for months. That milk, that cheese, becomes your liquid winter lifeline, a source of fat, protein, calories, and vital hydration when snow is your only other water source. The individuals who could digest this milk without sickness thrived. Their children thrived. The mutation spread with astonishing speed. That glass of milk you can drink without a thought, that is not just a dietary habit. It is the genetic scar of a winter survival strategy so successful it rewrote our very DNA. It is your ancestors' winter ration, still echoing in your gut. So we have the full picture now. The fortress was not a prison. It was a base of operations. From within the warmth of the social hive, fueled by the medicine of smoke and the economy of shared heat, they launched precise, knowledgeable forays into the winter world. They harvested the frozen shorelines. They tracked the animals that knew the secret plants. They drew nutrition from the very herds they sheltered. They turned the longest, darkest, coldest season into a period of focused cultural creation, of social bonding, and of targeted, intelligent harvest. This is what you have inherited. That Sunday lethargy is your metabolism remembering the wisdom of conservation. Your love of a crackling fire is your lungs' memory of the shield. Your craving for stews, for hearty, communal meals, is your body asking for the winter fuel that built tribes. And that faint tightness in your knuckle, the ghost of a door on a cold day, it is a whisper from a time when the cold was not a nuisance, but a teacher that forged the very shape of human society, connection, and ingenuity. A teacher whose lessons are still written in your bones, your breath, and your blood. But understanding the winter world was only half the battle. Knowing where the food was meant nothing. If you couldn't get to it, or if it couldn't get to you, the cold was a lock, and your ancestors had to pick it. The key was not in their muscles, but in their feet. Feel the solid floor beneath you now, flat and even. Your steps are a matter of balance, not survival. But out there, in the glacial dawn, the ground was a treacherous lattice of ice, rock, and hidden voids. A sprained ankle was a death sentence. A slip into a ravine was the end of your line. Moving across this landscape required a technology so seamless we've forgotten it's a technology at all. The ability to walk without thinking. They developed a gait for the ice, a way of placing the foot that was less a step and more a controlled, testing slide. Knees slightly bent, weight centered, arms out for balance. Not the brisk, heel-to-toe stride of a summer plane, but a patient, rolling motion from the outside edge of the foot inward. It conserved energy, maximized surface area, and sensed the ground for cracks and thin ice before committing full weight. Children learned it by following exactly in the footsteps of the adult in front of them. A single-file line of silent travelers etching a temporary, safe path across the white. And when the snow was too deep, the powder swallowing them up to their thighs, they invented the world's first terrain transformer. Not the wheel. The snowshoe. It wasn't a recreational device. It was a calorie-saving miracle. Walking through deep snow without them is an exhausting, crushing labor. With them, your weight is distributed over a surface area 5 or 6 times larger. You stay on top. You glide. The difference in energy expenditure is staggering. It can cut the cost of a winter journey by 2/3. Those saved calories were the margin between a successful hunting trip and a fatal one. But the most brilliant adaptations weren't something they carried. They were something they wore, and they changed the very architecture of the human form. Consider your own hands, resting now. The fingers can move independently, delicate and precise. That dexterity is a summer gift. In deep cold, it becomes a liability. Exposed fingers lose heat fast, the blood retreating to protect the core. Numbness sets in, and with it, the catastrophic loss of the fine motor skills needed to tie a knot, to adjust a snare, to start a fire. So the winter mitten was born, but not as a tiny, individual pouch for each finger. The most effective ancient mittens, found preserved in ice from the Alps to the Andes, often grouped the fingers together. The thumb was separate, but the four fingers shared a single, warm chamber. It looked crude, but it was thermal genius. By keeping the fingers in direct contact with each other, they shared warmth, creating a single, warmer microclimate. The loss of individual dexterity was a calculated trait. You gained a hand that could stay functional in cold that would otherwise disable it. You could still grasp a spear, haul a net, or clutch a fire-starting kit. The mittens said, "It is better to have a warm, slightly clumsy hand than a dexterous, frozen one." This principle extended to their entire posture. Look at the art they left behind from these icy periods. The so-called Venus figurines found from Siberia to France. Archaeologists have long debated their meaning, but one consistent feature is their exaggerated, rounded torsos and tucked limbs. Some researchers now suggest these are not just symbols of fertility, but portraits of the optimal winter survival posture. In extreme cold, you curl in. You round your shoulders, tuck your chin, bring your arms close to your torso, your legs up toward your chest. You make yourself as sphere-like as possible, minimizing surface area, conserving the heat at your core. These figurines, held in the hand in the dim firelight, may have been less an object of worship and more a physical reminder. This is the shape of warmth. This is the posture of endurance. Yet, for all their ingenuity with gear and gait, the most critical resource was not in their hands or at their feet. It was inside their own skulls, and it was running out. The cold starved the body, but the endless gray, the abbreviated days, the monochrome landscape, it starved the mind. Sensory deprivation in a survival situation is a special kind of torture. The mind, deprived of novelty, turns inward. Boredom curdles into listlessness, then into a despair that saps the will to even try. Apathy is a luxury no winter survivor could afford, so they weaponized the only things they had left: sound and memory. This is where the Winter Symphony began, not with instruments, but with the environment itself. They listened to the ice. The boom and crack of a glacier calving in the distance was a calendar event, marking the slow turn of the season. The wind whistling through a specific canyon pass told them a storm was gathering long before they saw the clouds. The different crunch of snow underfoot, a sharp, crystalline sound meant bitter cold and a stable crust. A dull, muffled quiet meant warmer air and new powder and potential danger. They mapped the world by ear, and they filled the silence they could control with rhythm. The repetitive thump-thump-thump of hide being softened, the scritch-scritch-scritch of a burin engraving bone, the steady, metronomic drip of fat into a fire from a roasting piece of meat. These were not just work noises. They were auditory anchors. They proved time was still passing, that work was being done, that life was progressing, even when the world outside seemed locked in a silent, white standstill. And then, in the deepest dark of the long nights, they performed the most vital mental technology of all, the memory palace. With nothing new to see, they journeyed through the landscapes of the past. An elder would begin, describing not just an event, but a place. The watering hole from 3 summers ago, in the drought. The exact bend in the river where the salmon run was thickest. The stand of oak trees, where the boar rooted for grubs. They would describe it in hypersensory detail. The smell of the wet earth, the color of the stone, the sound of the insects and the heat. The listeners, eyes closed, would walk through it in their minds. They were not just remembering food sources. They were rehearsing routes, reinforcing vital knowledge for the coming spring. They were keeping their internal maps alive and vivid, exercising the neural pathways for navigation, so they wouldn't atrophy during the months of confinement. This mental travel had a side effect. It stitched the band's experiences into a single, shared story. Your memory of the river bend became my memory. My recollection of the bear cave became yours. The winter became the time when individual knowledge was fused into collective intelligence. By the time the snow melted, they didn't just have a plan. They had one mind, with many bodies ready to execute it. But all of this, the snowshoes, the mittens, the memory palaces, was predicated on one brutal, non-negotiable fact. To think, to move, to even shiver, you need fuel. And the greatest winter puzzle was not how to find food, but how to process what you found, because winter food fights back. A frozen carcass is a rock. A root pulled from the iron-hard ground is a wooden stake. Your teeth, evolved for tearing tender meat and crushing summer fruits, are inadequate. They would shatter. The solution wasn't stronger jaws. It was smarter cooking. The winter kitchen was a chemistry lab. They understood that heat did more than make food palatable. It transformed its very structure. slow, sustained heat, the kind from stones heated in a fire pit, and then buried with a wrapped piece of tough meat or a pouch of fibrous roots, didn't just thaw. It broke down collagen, it gelatinized starches, it predigested the meal. A cut of meat that would have taken hours of chewing and precious calorie expenditure to process could, after a day in a stone-steam pit, be eaten easily, its nutrients readily absorbed. They were extracting every possible calorie, and they knew that some vessels held more than others. This is where the most unassuming winter artifact speaks volumes: the birch bark container. Found across the northern forests, these containers, stitched with spruce root and sealed with pine resin, were more than bowls. They were calorie multipliers. You cannot safely put a hollowed-out stone or a clay pot directly on a flame. It will crack. But birch bark is flexible and resilient. You can fill it with water and meat, and then, using hot stones from the fire, bring it to a boil. You can render fat. You can create rich, slow-simmered broths that extracted every last bit of nutrition from bones and sinew, creating a digestible, warming, mineral-rich drink. This wasn't just soup. It was liquid sustenance, a way to hydrate and feed the sick and the weak. Who could not chew? The birch bark bowl was the winter ICU, and the stone was its foredrip. Yet, for all this focus on the body and the mind, there was one final, chilling adversary they had no technology for, one that left no mark on bones or tools, but must have haunted their darkest nights. It wasn't the cold, or the hunger, or the predators. It was the silence of the stars on a clear, frigid night, the sheer, indifferent scale of the universe, visible in the crisp winter air with a clarity summer humidity never allows. In summer, life was abundant, distracting. In winter, stripped bare, the world revealed its true, stark face, a beautiful, immense, and utterly unconcerned void. Facing that, without the comfort of modern cosmology, could break a spirit. So they did the only thing that has ever worked against existential dread. They filled the void with story. They looked up at those impossible, cold, bright stars and connected them into shapes, not random pictures, but narratives of their own world. That cluster there became the great winter reindeer. That band of light was the river of souls, frozen in the sky. The stories they told by the fire were mirrored in the sky above the smoke hole. The universe was no longer indifferent. It was a grand, frozen storybook, telling their own tales back to them. The winter sky became a map, a myth, a companion in the emptiness. It was the ultimate act of cognitive survival, to look into the abyss and see not a void, but a reflection of your own enduring fire.